A cold wind rips across the empty field, swirling dead leaves in a violent dance. From his window, a man watches, his jaw tight. For weeks, the encroachment has been slow, then brazen a parade of SUVs, a disrespect as loud as the slamming doors. But tonight, as the first hard frost glitters under the moon, a different kind of cold settles in his eyes. He walks outside, dragging a thick hose behind him. The low hum of a water pump, a defiant rumble in the silence. This isn't just about a boundary line anymore. It's about a man pushed too far, about a frozen, brutal idea of justice. And for a woman who thought she could park anywhere, the next morning would reveal a very slippery, very public lesson. The first car had been an accident, or at least, that's what Mark had told himself. A sleek, midnight blue sedan, its tires a fresh scar on the soft earth of his back lot. It had appeared 3 weeks ago, a few dozen feet from the line that separated his quiet, wild acres from the meticulously manicured lawn of his new neighbors, the Millers. He hadn't thought much of it then. New people, still figuring things out. He'd simply put a polite, handwritten note under the windshield wiper, a note that said, "Hello, welcome to the neighborhood. Just a friendly reminder that this is private property. Please park on your side of the line. Thanks." He'd even added a smiley face. He was a man who believed in goodwill and neighborly kindness. It was, in his world, the cost of doing business. The next morning, the note was gone, but the car remained. It was joined, that afternoon, by a minivan. That was the beginning. What followed was an escalation that felt less like a series of misunderstandings and more like a carefully orchestrated invasion. Within a week, the Millers' driveway, a vast 3-car-wide expanse of pristine cobblestones, sat empty, while a small fleet of vehicles belonging to what seemed to be their ever-expanding family claimed squatters' rights on Mark's property. There was the minivan, the blue sedan, a massive, rusted-out pickup truck that leaked oil, and even a compact car that looked like a clown car with a dented bumper. The oil stains were the first direct strike, a permanent black ink blot on the ground where his wildflower patch was supposed to be. Mark had tried to be reasonable. He was a software engineer by trade, a man who believed in logic and a step-by-step approach to problem-solving. First, the note. When that failed, he tried the face-to-face approach. He walked over to their house on a Saturday, a day he'd normally spend pruning his prize-winning roses. He rang the doorbell. A woman in her late 40s, with a severe blonde bob and a floral apron cinched at her waist, answered the door. She was Karen Miller. He'd learned from the welcome basket he'd dropped off a month prior. Her face, a roadmap of perpetual disapproval, seemed to tighten even more upon seeing him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice an icy blade. "Hi, Karen. It's Mark, from next door," he said, trying to project a neighborly warmth that was quickly dissipating. "I just wanted to talk to you about the cars. You've got quite a few of them parked on my property." Karen's lips curled into a thin line. "Oh, you mean that patch of dirt?" He felt a prickle of heat rise in his chest. "It's my property. It's a field I've been meaning to landscape. The cars, They're leaving oil stains. And they're blocking my access." "Blocking what access?" "It's just a field," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "Look, we have a big family. My sister and her husband are staying with us. They have kids. We're having a few people over this weekend. Where else are they going to park? Your driveway's so long, you have so much space." "My driveway isn't for your family," Mark said, his tone firming. "And I don't appreciate the cars on my land. I'd like you to move them, all of them." She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Seriously, what are you going to do? Put up a fence? It's not like you're using it for anything important. We'll move them later, after everyone leaves." "That's not good enough," he said, the politeness now a brittle memory. "I'm asking you, politely, to respect my property. And I'm telling you, politely, to get a life." She shot back, a condescending smile playing on her lips. "This is a suburban neighborhood, not your private wilderness. Get over it." With that, she slammed the door in his face. Mark stood on her welcome mat, the echo of the slam ringing in his ears. The humiliation was a physical ache. The entitlement, the sheer audacity of her response, left him speechless. He walked back to his side of the property, a knot of fury tightening in his gut. The Miller's driveway, still perfectly empty, mocked him. His next move was to call the police. The non-emergency line, of course. A friendly, tired-sounding dispatcher listened to his story, then sighed. "Sir, this sounds like a civil matter. If they're not blocking a public road or an emergency exit, we can't really get involved. It's on private property. You'd need to go through the courts to get an injunction or something." The suggestion of legal action, a lengthy, expensive, and emotionally draining process, felt like a joke. He hung up, more defeated than ever. He then tried the local HOA. The secretary, a perky woman named Brenda, listened with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. "Oh, Mark, I'm so sorry. I've heard the Millers can be difficult, but our bylaws on parking are a little vague. It's all about public spaces. Since they're not on the street, and it's not a common area, we can't really enforce anything. I could send them a letter, but..." She trailed off, the unspoken message clear, A letter from the HOA was as good as a folded-up paper airplane. His frustration festered. Every day, he watched from his kitchen window as the Miller family, a revolving cast of entitled characters, treated his field as their personal parking lot. The kids would play on the grass, dropping empty soda cans and Huffy-Ton chip bags. The pickup truck's driver, a burly man with a perpetually angry face who Mark assumed was Karen's husband, would rev the engine loudly every morning, spewing exhaust over Mark's prize-winning roses. It had gone beyond a simple parking dispute. It was now a battle for his sanity, a testament to the Millers' complete and utter disregard for their surroundings. The breaking point arrived on a Friday night. Mark was expecting his elderly mother to visit for the weekend. He'd meticulously cleaned the house, baked her favorite cinnamon rolls, and was now waiting for her to arrive. The Millers, it turned out, were hosting a party. Not a small neighborly get-together, but a full-blown block party, it seemed. So many cars lined the street, spilled onto the Millers' lawn, and, of course, completely choked off his own property. There must have been at least 10 new vehicles on his field, forming a solid, impenetrable wall. His mother called him from her cell phone. "Mark, I'm here, but I can't get to your house. There are cars everywhere. A big white SUV is blocking the end of your driveway. I've been honking, but no one seems to care." Mark's blood ran cold. His mother, who was recovering from a hip replacement, was stuck on the street, unable to get to the house she loved. He stormed out of his front door, a righteous fury burning away all sense of decorum. He strode over to the Millers' house, the sound of their party loud music, raucous laughter a grating insult. He found a man at the grill, flipping burgers. It was Karen's husband, Greg. "Greg," Mark shouted over the music. "You need to move your cars. My mother is outside and she can't get in." Greg, a man with a beer in one hand and a spatula in the other, looked at him with an expression of bored annoyance. "Dude, chill. It's a party. We'll move them in a bit. Find a spot on the street or something. The cars are on my property, and they're blocking my driveway. My mother is old. She can't walk all the way down here." "Tough luck," Greg said, turning back to his burgers. "We're a little busy right now." That was it. The last thread of his patience snapped. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was malicious disregard. He went back to his own yard, his hands trembling with a rage so potent it felt like a physical force. He called his mother back, his voice strained but calm. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm going to find a spot for you to park a little farther down the street. Just stay put." As he helped his mother into the house, a plan, both reckless and brilliant, began to form in his mind. He was no longer going to reason with them. He was no longer going to seek external help. He was going to solve this problem himself, in the way that spoke a language they would understand. He looked out the window at the cars littering his field. He looked at his mother, tired and a little shaken, sitting on his couch. And then he looked at the weather forecast on his phone. The temperature was dropping. A cold front was moving in, bringing with it a week of hard sub-zero temperatures. It was the perfect storm. He had a well on his property, a powerful pump, and a few hundred feet of industrial-grade hose he'd used for a summer irrigation project. He also had an idea, an almost gleeful, vengeful idea, that felt like an act of pure, unadulterated genius. He wouldn't just ask them to move. He would make it impossible for them to ever park there again. He'd teach them a lesson they would never forget. That night, as the cold deepened and the air grew still, Mark walked out into his field. The ground was already frozen solid. He laid out the hoses, connecting them to the well pump. The air was so cold his breath plumed in front of his face. He checked the connection one last time, ensuring a wide, even spray. He flipped the switch, and with a low hydraulic groan, the pump came to life. A torrent of cold well water shot out, arcing high into the next morning, a piercing shriek cut through the crisp, quiet air. It was a sound Mark had been waiting for, a sound that brought a slow, satisfied smile to his lips. He was sitting at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of pink and gold. When Karen Miller appeared at his back window, her face was a mask of furious, uncomprehending rage, her hands balled into fists. She pointed an accusing finger at the field, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Mark simply lifted his coffee cup in a silent, mocking salute. Outside, the chaos had begun. The Millers' party guests, bleary-eyed and hungover, were emerging, to find their cars encased in a shimmering, impenetrable layer of ice. The pickup truck was a grotesque ice sculpture, its tires and undercarriage fused to the ground. The minivan's doors were frozen shut, the windows a solid sheet of frosted glass. A chorus of angry murmurs and confused shouts filled the air. As people began to assess the situation, Karen, her blonde bob now slightly askew, stormed over to the driver of the blue sedan, a young man who looked like he'd just woken up. "Move it," she commanded, her voice raw. "I can't, Aunt Karen. It's stuck. I can't even get the door open." Greg, Karen's husband, lumbered out of the house, scratching his stomach. "What's all the racket about? The party was last night. Get a move on." His eyes landed on the frozen field and his jaw went slack. "What the fuck?" The young man tried to open his car door again, straining until his face turned red. The sound of the ice cracking under the force was a small victory, but the door remained stubbornly sealed. He then tried to rock the car back and forth, but the tires simply spun, the rubber burning and smoking against the polished ice, making no headway at all. The car was going nowhere. Karen, a woman used to getting her way, was not about to accept this. She grabbed a rock from her lawn and began to furiously scrape at the ice on the windshield. The rock made a terrible grating sound, but the ice barely chipped. "Greg, get the rock salt, get the blowtorch, do something," she screamed, her composure completely gone. Greg, looking bewildered, went back into the garage and emerged with a bag of rock salt. He began to scatter it, but the salt just sat there on the surface, doing nothing. The ice was too thick, too solid. The blowtorch, a tool of last resort, did no better. It melted a small, circular puddle, but the surrounding ice was so cold, it refroze almost instantly. The cars were immovable, a perfectly placed, frustratingly permanent art installation. Mark, having finished his coffee, went outside to water his roses. He took his time, humming a cheerful tune. As he turned on the hose, he saw Karen and Greg stomping toward him, their faces twisted in a grotesque parody of fury. The morning sun glinted off the ice, turning the field into a blinding white. "Mere you," Karen screeched, pointing at him with a trembling finger. "You did this. You froze our cars." Mark turned to her, a serene, almost unnerving calm on his face. "Did what?" "Oh, you mean my ice rink?" he said, gesturing to the field. "The forecast said it was going to be cold, so I thought, why not get a little jump on my winter project? You know, make a little ice rink for myself." "An ice rink? You froze our cars in an ice rink?" Greg roared, his voice a low growl. "You're crazy, crazy," Mark asked, a small, genuine laugh escaping his lips. "I thought you'd be pleased. You said you didn't have any space in your driveway, and you had so much family over. I just helped you find a place for them to stay. The cars, I mean, they're all in one nice convenient place now. And hey, I'm sure your relatives love a good winter sport. Just grab a pair of skates and you'll be set." Karen's face was a study in pure venom. "This is not over. Mark, you are going to get those cars out. Now, or I'm calling the police." "You're welcome to call the police, Karen," Mark said, his voice, dropping an octave, losing its playful edge. "I already did when your family was blocking my driveway and keeping my elderly mother from getting to my house. The police told me it was a civil matter, so I handled it. They're on my property. I made a new use for my property. Last I checked, that's not a crime." He saw the frustration in her eyes. The police couldn't help. The HOA couldn't help. He had played by the rules, and they had dismissed him, and now he had made his own rules, and he was winning. "This is property damage," Greg bellowed, his voice straining. "That's a crime." "Is it?" Mark replied, his voice a cool, rational counterpoint to Greg's rage. "There's no damage. The cars are just stuck. Once the ice melts, they'll be free to go. And considering it's going to be below freezing for the next week, I'd say you have plenty of time to figure out a new parking solution." He watched them, their fury, a hot, impotent steam against the cold morning air. They had underestimated him, mocked his politeness, and now they were seeing a different man entirely. A man who was meticulous, a man who thought ahead, a man who, when pushed, would find the most logical and absurdly effective way to get his point across. He saw Greg's hands clenching, and for a moment he thought the man might charge him, but Karen grabbed his arm, her eyes still locked on Mark's. She was defeated, but not for long. He could see the gears turning in her head, the beginning of a new plan, a new way to try to break him. "You haven't won," she said, her voice a low, hissing whisper. "Not yet." Mark just smiled. He knew the fight had just begun. He turned back to his roses, leaving them stranded on the edge of his frozen land, their cars an Arctic monument to their own hubris. As he was about to go back inside, he heard the distinct sound of a news van pulling up on the street. It was a local station, News 8 Investigates, with a camera crew already setting up. He watched, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach, as a woman in a bright red coat and a headset, microphone in hand, approached Karen and Greg. This wasn't just his problem anymore. This was a spectacle. The news reporter, a sharp-faced woman named Sarah Jenkins, wasted no time. Her cameraman, a lanky guy with a perpetually bored expression, had the lens pointed directly at the field of frozen cars. The morning light bounced off the ice, creating a dazzling, surreal landscape. Sarah held the microphone to her mouth, her voice professional and crisp as she spoke to the camera. "We're here in the quiet suburb of Meadow Creek, where a neighborhood dispute has taken a very dramatic and some might say, creative turn. As you can see behind me, a series of vehicles are now completely immobilized, encased in a sheet of ice that now covers a neighbor's property." Karen, seeing the camera, suddenly transformed. Her furious scowl vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed trembling expression of victory. She straightened her floral apron and began to speak to Sarah in a breathless, theatrical rush. It's unbelievable. We have family here, a little get-together, and this man, Mark, from next door, he just froze our cars. He came out in the middle of the night and did this." She pointed a shaky finger at Mark, who was now standing a little farther away. Observing the scene, Sarah turned her attention to Mark. "Sir, can you confirm these accusations?" Mark walked over slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. He wasn't going to be drawn into a shouting match. He looked directly into the camera, his posture straight, his expression serious. "My name is Mark. This is my property. For weeks my neighbors and their guests have been parking here without permission, leaving litter and oil stains. I asked them politely to stop. I called the police, who said it was a civil matter. I contacted the HOA, who said they couldn't help last night. My elderly mother, who is recovering from a hip replacement, was blocked from getting to my house because of their party guests. I had to park her car a block away and help her walk." His words were a cold, hard counterpoint to Karen's emotional appeal. He wasn't yelling, he was simply stating facts. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his statement sink in. "So, in response, I decided to use my property for a new purpose. It's been below freezing for a while, and the forecast says it will continue to be. I simply created a new winter feature for my yard, an ice rink. I'm not damaging their property. The cars are just temporarily stuck on a perfectly smooth, perfectly legal sheet of ice on my own land. Once the weather warms up, they'll be able to move them." A small, almost imperceptible smirk played on Sarah's lips. She clearly saw the irony of the situation. Karen, however, was fuming. "It's a deliberate act of malice. He's holding our cars hostage," she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured outrage. "We tried to move them," Greg interjected, his voice a low, resentful growl. "They won't budge. He's trapped us. We're going to miss work. My son has a doctor's appointment. He's jeopardizing our lives over a parking spot." The camera turned to the field, zooming in on the pickup truck, its tires spinning uselessly on the glassy surface. The visual spoke volumes. Mark, still calm, stepped forward again. "I did what I had to do to protect my property. If they want to get to work, they can use their empty driveway." He gestured to the Millers' pristine driveway, a silent, damning indictment of their hypocrisy. Suddenly, a new voice cut in. A young man, the driver of the dented compact car, ran up with a shovel. "We'll just break the ice," he shouted, his eyes wild with anger. He swung the shovel with all his might at the ice surrounding his tire. The shovel bounced off with a loud ringing clang, a deep gouge appearing on its metal blade. The ice, however, was barely scratched. He swung again, and again, but the result was the same. The shovel was useless. Sarah, the reporter, captured the entire futile display. She then turned back to the camera. "It seems that for now, the cars are well and truly stuck. With temperatures expected to remain below freezing for the next several days, the standoff continues. We'll be keeping a close eye on this icy situation. Back to you in the studio." The news crew packed up and left. The silence that followed was heavy and fraught with a new kind of tension. Karen and Greg were left, standing on the edge of their lawn, their faces pale with rage. They were no longer just arguing with their neighbor. They had just been the subjects of a local news story, a national embarrassment waiting to happen. Mark watched them, a grim satisfaction returning. He had won the first round of public opinion, but he knew this wasn't the end. The battle had just gone viral, and the Millers were not the type of people to let a loss like this go unpunished. He knew they were desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. And as he watched Greg walk toward his tool shed with a grim determination, Mark knew the real fight was about to begin. The silence after the news van departed was a hollow, tense thing, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the next act of aggression. Karen stood on the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed to slits as she watched Greg disappear into the garage. He re-emerged a few moments later, not with a blowtorch, but with a tool that made Mark's stomach clench. A massive industrial-grade power jackhammer, the kind used for breaking up concrete. Its electric cord, a thick black snake, snaked its way across their lawn, across the property line, and toward the field. "Greg, what are you doing?" Karen shrieked, a new note of hysteria in her voice. "I'm getting our cars back," he growled, his face a mask of determined fury. He hoisted the heavy machine onto his shoulder and lumbered toward the frozen pickup truck, a hulking monument to his own stubbornness. "You can't just, you'll damage the car," she pleaded, but it was too late. Greg was a man possessed, his mind clouded by a potent mixture of anger and public humiliation. The news crew, the reporters barely contained smirk. The sound of Mark's.com logical voice, it all fueled the furnace of his rage. He had to win. He had to be right. He planted his feet in the thin, icy layer of Mark's lawn, which hadn't been a target for the hose, and positioned the heavy steel bit of the jackhammer. He didn't aim it at the ice surrounding the tires. He aimed it directly at the massive, opaque slab of ice beneath the undercarriage of his truck, the part that had frozen it solid. He pulled the trigger. The sound was a horrific, percussive assault. The jackhammer chattered and roared, a deep guttural vibration that shook the ground. Ice shards, like shrapnel, exploded in every direction, a glittering, dangerous storm. Mark, watching from his window, flinched as a large chunk of ice slammed into his kitchen window, leaving a spiderweb of cracks. This was no longer a game of passive aggression. This was a war. Greg worked furiously, his face a grimace of exertion. He was a bull, a force of pure, unthinking will. He chipped away at the ice for a full 10 minutes, a cloud of frozen dust. Obscuring his work, Karen stood back, a hand over her mouth, watching the slow, brutal destruction unfold. The pickup truck, which was already leaking oil, now had a new layer of damage. The undercarriage was scratched and dented, and the ice, though chipped, was still a solid, unbroken mass beneath the wheels. "It's not working," Karen yelled over the din. "Stop, Greg, you're just going to break the truck." He ignored her, his eyes fixed on the ice. He moved the jackhammer bit to a new spot, right near the rear wheel well, a place where he was sure he could break through. He pressed the trigger again, the machine roaring to life. He leaned into it, his full weight pushing the bit down, down, down. He felt a satisfying crack, a sensation of breakthrough. He grinned, his face streaked with sweat and ice dust. He'd done it. He'd won. But the sound that followed was not the sound of a victorious car being freed. It was a gurgling, hissing noise, a sound of rushing liquid. A dark, pungent stream of gasoline began to pour from the undercarriage of the pickup truck. Not from the frozen tank itself, but from a line that had been ruptured by the jackhammer's violent vibrations. The gasoline, mixing with the melting ice, turned the crystalline surface into a slick, oily sheen. Karen screamed, "Greg, the gas! You hit the gas line!" He stared at the puddle spreading across the ice. A puddle of his own making, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. The fuel, a slow toxic leak, was now a serious environmental hazard on his neighbor's property. And as he stared, dumbfounded, at his mistake, he heard a new sound, a sound of sirens approaching in the distance. This time, they weren't for the parking dispute. This time, they were for him. For property damage, for an environmental spill. He had tried to win, and in doing so, had just unleashed a catastrophe far worse than a few frozen cars. The sirens grew louder, a wailing, mournful cry that echoed down the quiet street. A sound of authority and consequences. First came the police car, its blue and red lights flashing a frantic rhythm against the white of the ice. Then, a fire truck, its enormous size a jarring contrast to the peaceful suburban setting. Finally, a small white pickup truck with the words "Environmental Response" emblazoned on the side. Mark watched from his kitchen window, the spiderweb cracks in the glass a tangible symbol of the escalating conflict. His grim satisfaction was now tinged with a heavy dose of anxiety. He had started this, but it had spiraled into something he never could have predicted. 2 police officers, a man and a woman, stepped out of their car. Their faces stern and unamused. They walked directly to Greg, who stood frozen by the gasoline leak, the jackhammer still in his hand, a look of abject panic on his face. Karen, her theatrical outrage now replaced with genuine fear, rushed to his side. "Sir, put the tool down," the male officer said, his voice a calm, authoritative command. Greg, trembling, dropped the jackhammer. It hit the ice with a thud, the cord a dead snake at his feet. "Can you explain what's going on here?" the female officer asked, her eyes sweeping from the broken gas line, to the massive gasoline puddle, to the field of frozen cars. Karen, ever the performer, tried to take control. "He did this, officer. Our neighbor, Mark, he froze our cars on his land. He's holding them hostage. We were just trying to get them out." The officer, however, seemed more interested in the gasoline. The smell was now thick and acrid in the air. "Ma'am, there's a ruptured fuel line and a significant gasoline spill on this property. Did you do this?" "No, Greg did. He was trying to get the ice off our truck, and he hit it by accident," she blurted out, throwing her husband under the bus without a moment's hesitation. Greg's face, already pale, went ashen. "Karen," he protested. "Sir, you're going to have to come with us," the male officer said to Greg, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We're going to have to question you about this. You've caused significant environmental damage and put the surrounding community at risk." The firefighters, meanwhile, were already at work. They were deploying large absorbent booms around the puddle to contain the gasoline, and a man in a hazmat suit was taking samples of the ground. The scene was no longer a domestic dispute. It was a bona fide crime scene. Karen, seeing her husband being led away in handcuffs, finally lost her composure. The theatrical tears were gone, replaced by real ones. "You can't do this. He didn't mean to. He was just trying to get our cars back from that lunatic." She pointed a trembling finger. At Mark's house, the officers ignored her. Their focus was entirely on the environmental hazard Greg had created. As Greg was being placed in the back of the patrol car, a final look of betrayal passed between him and Karen. A look that said, "I'll never forget this." Mark, watching this spectacle unfold, felt a pang of something more complex than satisfaction. This was no longer about a parking spot. This was about a family torn apart by their own hubris and a cascade of poor decisions. He had set a trap, but they had sprung it in a way that was far more destructive than he could have imagined. And the consequences, he knew, were just beginning. As the patrol car pulled away, with a bewildered Greg in the back, the environmental response team began to use a small powered auger to drill holes in the ice. preparing for a long, arduous, and very expensive cleanup. A cleanup that would be happening on Mark's property, a cost that, by all rights, would be laid squarely at Greg's feet. And as Mark watched the scene, a new fear crept into his heart. The Millers were down, but they were not out. Karen was still on the loose, a woman who blamed him for everything. He knew she would be back, and her next move would be even more unpredictable and dangerous than the last. The day after Greg's arrest, the neighborhood was eerily silent. The environmental crew had worked through the night, their floodlights casting a stark, artificial glow on the polluted ice. The cars were still there, frozen monuments to a feud that had gone horribly wrong. Mark's house, which had become a fortress, now felt more like a cage. He watched from behind his cracked window as Karen, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure, paced her lawn. She was a woman stripped of her bluster and public facade, left with only the bitter dregs of her own entitlement. Mark knew she was planning something. He could feel it in the air, a chilling certainty that went beyond the cold. He had been right about the first cold front, and he was sure he was right about this. He decided to go to work, leaving his mother with a fully charged phone and a strict instruction to not answer the door for anyone. He spent the day at his office, but his mind was not on his code. It was on the cold, unforgiving landscape of his backlot. He worried about his mother. He worried about what Karen would do next. The public humiliation, the financial ruin of a massive cleanup, and now her husband's legal troubles. It was all a cauldron of vengeful emotion waiting to boil over. That evening, he drove home with a sense of dread. The dread was justified. As he turned onto his street, he saw a new vehicle parked on his property, just beyond the line where the cleanup crew was working. It wasn't one of the frozen cars. It was a brand new, pristine red tow truck, its powerful winch already extended toward the minivan, its cable shimmering in the fading light. Karen stood beside it, her face a grim, triumphant mask. She held a clipboard and was talking to a massive man with a thick neck and a sleeveless denim jacket. This was her latest and most audacious move. She had hired a private towing company, circumventing the legal and civil systems that had failed. Her Mark pulled into his driveway and stormed toward her. "Karen, what the hell do you think you're doing?" She turned to him, a cold, empty smile on her face. "I'm getting our cars back, Mark. You said they were on your property, and you said the cleanup crew was on your property. Well, this tow truck is on my property, my side of the line." She gestured to the thin strip of grass where the truck was parked. The Miller's lawn, a few feet from the tow truck's wheels, was a perfect, legal parking spot. "He's going to damage my property?" Mark shouted, pointing to the thick cable snaking across his frozen land. "How, it's just a cable on a frozen surface. It's not damaging anything," she said, her voice a low, mocking whisper. "You said yourself that the cars are just stuck? I'm just unsticking them. This is a private towing company. This is a civil matter." Remember that. He felt the blood drain from his face. She had used his own logic against him. The tow truck was on her property. The cars were on his. As long as the tow truck driver didn't step on Mark's land, he was technically within his rights. The driver, a man of few words, simply nodded at Karen and turned a lever. The winch groaned, and the cable tightened. The frozen minivan, a hulking tomb of ice, was now under immense strain. The ice around it groaned and cracked, but it held firm. The driver increased the tension, and the tow truck's rear wheels lifted. Slightly off the ground, the minivan was not moving. The ice, a solid 2-foot-thick sheet, was too strong. Karen's face fell. But then she noticed something. The minivan wasn't moving, but something else was. The ice around the perimeter of Mark's property, the ice that bordered his house, the ice that covered his rosebush sit, was shifting. The cable, a powerful lever of metal and tension, was pulling on the entire sheet of ice, a solid mass, that was now threatening to pull a section of his land right out of the ground. The jackhammer had failed. The tow truck was failing, and in their collective desperation, the Millers were about to do something far more destructive than either of them could have imagined. The cable tightened again. There was a groaning sound from beneath the ice, a deep, earthy rumble. Suddenly, with a terrible splitting shriek, a huge section of the ice ripped free from the ground, pulling with it a massive chunk of Mark's yard. And attached to that chunk, ripped from the earth like a bad tooth, was the entire well pump he had used to create the rink. Water began to gush from the ruptured line, a powerful, uncontrollable torrent. It was rushing toward his house, a freezing, destructive flood. Karen stared in horror as the water advanced. The tow truck driver standing by, a look of shocked incomprehension on his face. She had won her battle, but in a way that had created a cataclysm for them all. Mark's field was not just a rink anymore, it was a disaster zone of her own making. And as the icy water began to pour into the basement of Mark's house, she knew that this time, there would be no going back. The consequences of her actions were not just an inconvenience for her family, but an entire world of destruction she had just unleashed upon herself.